Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question was suggested by a viewer. Thanks to Vote for this one. Amy plays a spell for its warp cost, and Nick counters it with a Syncopate. Since Amy's spell is now exiled, can Amy play it from exile because of the warp ability? Alright, so obviously you can't just cast spells from the exile zone normally. Like if Amy got a Grizzly Bears or something syncopated, I don't think anyone would be asking if she could replay that, right? So anytime you cast a spell, there needs to be some rule or effect that's letting you cast it. Now, if you're just casting the spell from your hand, each card type has a rule like this one that lets you cast it, but obviously that's not going to help if you want to cast from exile. So we need to take a look at how warp officially works in order to figure out if there's anything special about casting the spell via warp that would change this answer. So here's the relevant rule in the CR, and we can see that it's not looking good for Amy. The way warp works is that there's a triggered ability that exiles the warp card at the end of the turn. The effect that gives you permission to cast that card from exile is one of the effects that happens as this triggered ability resolves. And that means if the warp card gets exiled in any other way, for example via a solitude or dying and then getting exiled out of the graveyard or getting countered with a syncopate, then you would not be able to cast it from exile because none of those things set up the permission that you need in order to cast it. Now, if you noticed, we had to look up specifically how warp works in the comprehensive rules in order to get this answer. Unfortunately, there's no way to know for sure that any other mechanic will work the same way unless you look up the specific rules for that mechanic. But I will say that this seems to be pretty similar for the other ones that I checked off the top of my head. For example, adventure cards likewise must resolve when you play the adventure half in order to permit you to cast the other half. The last thing that I want to look at is how warp interacts with some other stuff that interferes with that triggered ability. For example, if you use Sundial of the Infinite or something like that to end the turn before the end step, the ability that exiles the warp card will not trigger that turn. But it will wait around until the next end step that actually does happen and exile it then. Since the warp triggered ability exiled the warp card, that would give you permission to cast it from exile the way that it normally does. On the other hand, if you counter that triggered ability or end the turn with it on the stack, it will not trigger again, meaning that your warp card would stay in play indefinitely. I talked about this in more detail in my video on how Sundial of the Infinite works with Through the Breach, so you can check that out if you'd like a fuller explanation. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.